Right, my name's James, and I paint miniatures. This is Spoon 37 Minis.
So in the previous video we took this Space Marine from bare blue plastic, painted it black all over with two thin coats and then blue all over with McCrae blue, and now we're going to do the silver details in Games Workshop Lead Belcher and the gold shoulder trim and so on in Balthazar Gold. Now just as before, the metallic paints need shaking. I've actually found with these particular two paints they need slightly less shaking than the others, but that might just be this particular batch of paints. And they should look well mixed. If you find they're all different colours and not a uniform colour, then yeah, they need more shaking. As before, insert the tube to stop the lid snapping shut, and then your paint pot's ready to go. Now we wash the brush, get some paint on the palette, and then we need to water it down in order to make it thinner. So we put it on the palette and then go to the water pot and add some water to it. This is quite thick, so we're adding water to it twice, and then we'll drag the brush back and twist it as we're dragging to make a nice sharp point. Now, unlike before, we're not actually painting huge swathes of armor, we're just picking out details. So we're going to start with the bolt gun, where obviously the gun barrel needs to be silver, and so do various other details like the sights, the magazine, and also it's convention that on these the thing at the back is usually exposed metal, whereas the body of the gun is usually colour, in this case black, but depending on the Space Marine chapter it could be another colour such as red. Now, just as with painting the armour, we do need to look at the model from every angle to make sure we get every part of these details covered. Some will be quite easy to see, others will be a little bit more involved, so you will just have to check it from every angle. Make sure you get paint on every part of the model that you need to. Another thing you'll want to do here is make reference to the box colour scheme that these came with, and check the picture, because what I realised here, and what isn't quite shown terribly well, is that I'm painting the very lower magazine, the movable part, but actually the part of the gun that it goes into is also meant to be silver, and I didn't actually realise whilst I was painting this. So do make reference to the box art or the official paint scheme when painting these, just to check these kind of details and see what colours parts are actually supposed to be. Now I'm taking a bit of extra care with this sight, because these are just protruding from the body of the gun. So I don't want to get too much silver paint on the body of the gun, I just want to get it on the actual iron sight itself. And then, as I say, there's this back area of the gun. I'm not quite sure what this is supposed to be called on a real gun, but the convention is the back of the bolt gun is always painted silver. I don't particularly know why, but I don't make up the paint schemes, it's just the way it is. keen-eyed observers may notice that I've accidentally gone across the black body of the gun, just painting some details on the back where there was meant to be a silver detail under the black, and then I've sort of cut the corner with the paintbrush. Don't worry about that too much, because I'm going to show you a little bit about error correction later on. So if that looks a little weird right now, don't worry about it. We're going to go over it with black paint later on to show you how to fix it. Now, just as with the previous video, in order to cut down the amount of time, I'm going to paint a little bit off camera and then come back and finish off with just the last few details. So you see, I've finished the gun, I've done large areas of the backpack, and now I'm just going to do a couple of little bits around the helm area. So the two on the sides, which I assume are something to do with the ears, and then there's a couple of little tubes right at the bottom of the mouth area of the faceplate, which also need to be silver. Now it is a little bit tricky getting into this area because of the blue colour that you don't want to get paint on. So much so I actually do accidentally get a little bit of silver paint on it. Which I didn't notice when I was actually doing this, but I noticed it very quickly afterwards. So that was about the time I decided it was a good idea to talk about error correction and painting over things when you have made a mistake. You can actually see it quite clearly on the blue colour now. So this is also an area where you really want a nice sharp tip on the brush. So when I keep saying to twist the brush as you pull it back to make it into a point, that's really where this is very, very useful. Now moving on, we have thoroughly washed the brush as shown in the previous video by waving it about in the water and trying it on the tissue, and now we're going to use the Balthasar gold colour, which should look like this when you open it. It's almost like a coppery colour rather than gold. It's quite dark as gold goes. But you find we need to paint the shoulder trim, the eagle symbol on the chest, and also the little eagle symbol on the gun. Now, just as before, we're having to water this down with a bit of water. This one, as it happens, needs slightly less water. So again, it might just be my paint rather than this being a universal thing with Balthasar Gold. So obviously you'll have to experiment at home if you're trying to follow along. And I'm just going to start painting the edge trim on the shoulder guards. Fun fact, when I started in the mid-90s, Ultramarines used to have bright yellow on the edges of their shoulder guards. And they seem to have decided at some point more recently that no, this should be metallic gold instead. So who am I to argue? We're painting them gold. Now, even though I'm going over this a little bit back and forth, the coloration is quite weak, so you'll see a little bit of blue still shows through, but don't worry about that. We are going to come back and do a second coat later on. What I actually found was the silver didn't improve very much from a second coat, but the gold pretty much changed colour entirely. So it does vary from paint to paint, but ideally you do 2 thin coats of everything, and that way you know you're going to get the right colour and a good coverage no matter what. As with the blue paint, I want to show you going over the edges of the shoulder guards, because when you see that, if you compare it to the box art, that area is actually meant to be gold on the going around the corner of the shoulder guard itself. So you do have to make sure to paint that properly, otherwise your model kind of looks half finished really. Now, I do want to show you painting the eagle symbol on the chest, because I know there's a lot of people out there thinking like, oh, well, you know, there's probably some trick to that and he's not going to show it on camera. Well, actually, the trick is being careful and having a nice sharp tip on your brush and trying not to accidentally paint things. Now, of course, I will do a follow-up video on painting this a bit easier, where you actually paint the model in pieces, which I call sub-assemblies, because you can glue pieces together, where the arms and the gun wouldn't be in the way. But as I fully assemble this model, this is how you have to do it. Obviously, painting it in this manner means you have to be very careful and keep a nice sharp tip on the brush, so I keep going back to the palette and just carefully painting it in from every angle until you finally get it finished. As you can see, the trick is really to rotate the model every which way until you can get the brush in without getting paint accidentally on the blue armor or the black gun or any other part that you don't want to be gold. But bit by bit, you can see it is actually gradually being painted gold. And that's about it. It is all covered. Now, it's particularly important with metallic pigments to thoroughly wash your brush. You don't want these stuck in the bristles once you come to paint a different colour, so you do wash the brush very thoroughly and wipe it on tissue. And then you'll need to remove the tube from the back and carefully close the paint pot and make sure it is closed so it doesn't start evaporating, which I've had happen to a few of my paints and it's quite annoying. Right, when I say after washing the brushes, I mean under running water, and I've also discarded the water that was in the water pot because you don't want metallic pigments getting in other paints. So now I actually have fresh water, and I'm pointing out several areas where I've actually made mistakes and let the paint go over onto the blue or black coloration. So we're now going to correct those. So starting off with some black paint, and I've actually got some gold that's gone over the edges, so we're just going to carefully paint close to that edge. There's also this bit I mentioned before where I've gone over with the silver when it should be a nice uniform sort of square edge there, and it's kind of had the corner cut off. Now, this isn't necessarily something you have to do every time. I just don't want to give you the impression that somehow I'm, you know, Superman and I never make a mistake and what have you. The reality is I make mistakes all the time, but I go over them later and correct them, and that way when people see a paint job and they're like, wow, that's, you know, that's really good, how did you do that? Well, the main reason is I actually went over my mistakes by painting over in the right colors. So it might seem impressive at a glance, but actually it's just, you know, being careful, and then when you haven't been careful enough, correcting what mistakes you made. One of the funny things about doing this is as you go over it, you start to notice even more mistakes than you had maybe planned to fix. So I'm noticing a couple of areas of this gasket material where actually it's supposed to be black and I've slightly got a bit of blue paint in it. So even though I hadn't particularly intended to paint those, I'm actually going over it and just making sure that it's right this time. Same again on this leg, it's just a little bit of blue where there shouldn't be, and that way we end up with everything with the right colour in the right places, which is all I'm really hoping for from this guide as a guide to painting your first miniature. addition to the black, there are also several areas of the blue armour where I've gone over the edges, such as the one I mentioned on the collar, easily fixed, but also there's a little bit of gold that's gone over the edge on the shoulder guard and one or two other areas where I've got only the tiniest bit of gold or silver in the wrong place, but just briefly going over it with some watered down McCrae blue is enough to fix the problem. Now you may notice at this point I'm going into a lot less detail about, you know, shaking the paint and thinning it down on the palette, because I assume if you watched the first video you kind of got the idea of what we're trying to do. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it for error correction. Obviously, if I had missed something else in another colour, I'd just keep going with different colours and so on. Okay, so having corrected some errors, we're now going to do second coats of the silver and gold paint, starting with the lead belcher metallic silver. We're just going to go over the same details, but we're going to go over them a second time just to make sure that A, we haven't missed anything, and B, that it has a nice uniform colour and that none of the black undercoat is shown through anywhere. It's worth noting that you could perhaps get away with one coat of the lead belcher. I did find that this didn't improve the colour dramatically, whereas the gold colour pretty much changed colour after 2 coats, so that was really worthwhile. Here I am actually just pressing the brush against some of the rivets sticking up. I didn't really show this the first time round, but you just try not to press it too hard into the body of the gun, because if you do, you'll end up with silver paint on the black body of the gun, which is a mistake I made a couple of times early on, which is why I had to do a bit of error correction. Now, it may not seem like it, but I am actually trying to be a little bit more careful this time. I don't want to get silver paint in the wrong places, but I also do want to get it in all of the right places, including areas that maybe I wasn't sure about the first time when I painted this. And so I just want to make sure that it has a nice, good coverage of the silver paint before moving on to painting the gold. So I carried on painting the lead belcher metallic silver off camera to do the backpack area, and now just going to finish off doing the helm area, which doesn't have many silver details, but just a couple to finish off. Hopefully this time when I'm painting the tubes near the faceplate, I won't actually get any paint on the nearby colour or the faceplate itself. It is a fine judgment though, so wasn't too surprised that I made a slight mistake earlier. Moving on, we're now going to be painting a second coat of Balthazar Gold. Obviously the brush has been thoroughly washed between colours because you don't want to contaminate either the paint in its paint pot or the brush or the model you're painting with the previous colour. So as I'm only using one brush for this from the Essentials kit, I'm obviously having to be extra careful and wash the brush extra thoroughly and then move on to the gold paint. Again, we've watered this down so it is another thin coat, but I think you can see already the colour is now already much stronger than it is on the chest or the other side shoulder pad. Right, a bit more painting off camera just to speed things up, and then we're going to finish off with painting the gold symbol on the chest once more. Now you might think, oh, it's good enough, but actually the colour does improve, and if you're just careful, you can actually get it to match the coloration on the other parts of the model. Whereas if you just left it as one, it would look a little bit weak, even though it's a difficult to reach area and you might be forgiven for doing that. If you went over it once, you can actually go over it again. Now we're getting towards the end of this video. This should take your first miniature to what's known as a 3-colour minimum. This actually has 4 colours on it: the black, the blue, the gold and the silver. But this is generally regarded as the bare minimum for a sort of tabletop paint standard. Going beyond this, the follow-up video to this will be all about painting the details. You can see things like the purity seal, the eyes, the base aren't actually painted at the moment, and those will all be covered in part 3.
Right, if you've stuck with it this far, firstly thank you for watching. If you did actually like the video, hit like, hit subscribe, hit the little bell shaped icon so you get notifications telling you when the next video will be out. I hope that will be soon. Thank you for watching.